Greetings. I am the coordinator of the Oral History Initiative at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I am honored to be here today to say a few words about Juneteenth. Along with the 4th of July, there is another Independence Day celebrated by African Americans, and that day is Juneteenth. Juneteenth refers to the date, June 19, 1865, when General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas with a force of 2,000 soldiers, some of them members of the United States Colored Troops, to issue Order Number 3, which stated, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." Of course, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation. The order goes on to define the relationship between former masters and slaves as that between employer and hired labor. Finally, it closes with the warning for freedmen not to be idle or collect at military posts. Despite the troubling clauses about remaining quietly at their present homes and not being allowed to idle, this was big news to the hundreds of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children who had continued to toil as human chattel in the Lone Star State throughout the war after the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st, 1863, and even months after the official ending of the Civil War in April of 1865. Plantation owners had managed to continue business as usual in Texas because throughout the war there had been very little Union presence in the state. The Emancipation Proclamation held no water in Confederate states that did not recognize the authority of the United States government. It could only be enforced with the presence of Union troops. For those of the enslaved who did not join the thousands of runaways, conditions remained largely unchanged, and in some cases worsened due to the pressures of the war. Some owners had to sell their slaves to pay for rising debts, while others uprooted families and moved to more remote places like Texas, where they felt more secure maintaining slave labor. There were some cases where the enslaved were left in charge of plantations while the owner joined the war effort, and sometimes the enslaved were taken to the front lines where they were put to work in support of the Confederacy. This quote, taken from an interview with a formerly enslaved woman in Arkansas, illustrates the attitude of some plantation owners towards the idea of Union soldiers coming in to enforce emancipation. Here she paraphrases the words and demeanor of her former owner. "Them Yankees ain't gonna get this far, but if and they do, you all ain't gonna get free by them because I'm gonna free you before that. When they get here, they're gonna find you already free because I'm gonna line you up on the bank of Boisdart Creek and free you with my shotgun. Anybody miss just one lick with the hoe, or one step in the line, or one clap of that bell, or one toot of the horn, and he gonna be free and talking to the devil long before he ever see a pair of blue breeches." It is perhaps difficult for us to imagine the range of emotions felt by enslaved men and women upon learning they were now free. This quote from Felix Haywood, a man enslaved in Texas, gives one perspective. "Soldiers all of a sudden was everywhere, coming in bunches, crossing and walking and riding. Everybody was singing. We was all walking on golden clouds. Hallelujah. Everybody went wild." And then this one from Charlotte Brown of Virginia. "The news come on a Thursday, and all the slaves been shouting and carrying on till everybody was quiet and peaceful. All at once, Sister Carrie, who was near about 100, started into talking. 'Tain't no more selling today. 'Tain't no more hiring today. 'Tain't no more pulling off shirts today. It's stomp down freedom today. Stomp it down.'" These excerpts from the WPA slave narratives conducted in the 1930s offer us a small peek into what the formerly enslaved were thinking and feeling in those moments after the arrival of General Gordon Granger and his 2,000 Union troops. And so, the first Juneteenth was held 1 year after that big announcement on June 19, 1866. Oral tradition maintains that a whole hog was barbecued, and the color red became a prominent symbol of the sacrifices made for freedom throughout slavery and its aftermath and during the Civil War. As the years went on, freedmen and women of Texas held Juneteenth celebrations despite the obstacles presented by a resistant white power structure that implemented a series of black codes to limit the newly found freedoms of African Americans almost as soon as the Civil War ended. One of those obstacles was having a space in which to gather. Whites attempted to thwart the observance of Juneteenth by denying large groups of Blacks access to land on which to celebrate. In response to this strategy, by 1872, only 6 years after the first Juneteenth, Reverend Jack Yates, a formerly enslaved man who became the leader of Antioch Baptist Church, formed the Colored People and Emancipation Park Association to purchase a plot of land that could be used for Juneteenth celebrations. The plot of land became known as Emancipation Park, and throughout the era of segregation, it was the only public park open to African Americans in Houston, Texas. In other towns throughout the South, similar strategies were used to secure safe spaces for Juneteenth observance. Thus, Juneteenth continued and even found a home amongst the African Americans who had run south to escape slavery in Texas to Mexico. To this day, descendants of those runaways hold a festival and reunion on June 19th called El Dia de los Negros, or the Day of the Blacks. And yet, even as Juneteenth is spreading throughout the United States, many are just learning about it for the first time. I, on the other hand, have known about it my whole life, and my family does not even have Texas roots. Back in 1969, my late father, Richard D. Navies, who was an activist historian and educator specializing in Black studies, learned about Juneteenth and decided that we would celebrate it when our family moved from Detroit, Michigan to Berkeley, California that August. For as long as I can remember, summer officially began with Juneteenth, which falls conveniently on or near the summer solstice. In the weeks leading up to the closest Saturday to June 19th, my father would strongly encourage my brothers and I to begin preparing presentation material for the open mic performance component that is an essential part of our Juneteenth events. I was encouraged to write poems and create dances that spoke to the theme of Juneteenth. We would also choose poetry from the canon of African American literature to recite, such as the works of Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, Claude McKay, and Sonia Sanchez. By the time I was 12, I had other duties as the only girl and the eldest sibling. I was drafted, and I mean that in every sense of the word, there was no choice in the matter, to be the mistress of ceremonies for the program. And in the days leading up to Juneteenth, I was in charge of cutting up all the ingredients for the tons of potato salad required for the feast: onions, celery, potatoes, and eggs. Each year, I would invite my closest friends over to spend the night and assist me with those duties, but for some reason, they often declined. My brothers had other work that required them to get down and dirty. They had to clean the yard and do the landscaping and other forms of manual labor needed on our Oakland, California property. What was all this for? Why did my St. Louis-born, Detroit-reared father decide to celebrate Juneteenth, a holiday which we have learned originated in Texas? Part of the answer lies in the historical context of the civil rights and Black Power movements of the late 1960s and early 70s. Juneteenth had actually waned in popularity in the years after World War II and would have perhaps disappeared from popular memory if not for the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. This was the last major campaign sponsored by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC before he was assassinated in April of that year. Initiated by Marion Wright Edelman and implemented by Ralph Abernathy and many others, the movement drew activists of all races and creeds from all over the country to a temporary compound built on the National Mall and called Resurrection City. Designed to call attention to the issue of poverty throughout America and to demand legislation to address that poverty. The impact of this event is still being assessed today, but one thing that is often overlooked is that the very last demonstration they held was Solidarity Day on June 19, 1968, Juneteenth. After Resurrection Day was dismantled, these activists took their knowledge of Juneteenth back to their hometowns throughout America. I'm sure that this is probably the way my father first heard about the holiday. Ironically, we have recently learned that two of our paternal ancestors were captains in the United States colored troops during the Civil War. In fact, one of their units was actually present at Galveston on June 19, 1865, although they themselves were no longer in service at that time. One can only imagine how knowing his direct ancestors played a central role in this historical drama would have bolstered my father's enthusiasm for Juneteenth. Instead, like other activists of the 60s and 70s, he was attracted to Juneteenth for several reasons. At a time of political and social upheaval and about 100 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth offered a way to strengthen community and to highlight three important ideas that lie at the heart of all Juneteenth celebrations: freedom, family, and joy. Juneteenth is a living, breathing meditation on the meaning of freedom. What did it mean for 4 million African Americans to suddenly be declared free with little to no resources, no land, no guarantee of citizenship rights? What does it mean today? Americans are still grappling with these questions, as can be seen in the continued interest in the idea and possibility of reparations. No matter where your feelings lie on this matter, it is clear that we Americans still struggle with the quandary of slavery and the meaning of freedom in this country. Last year, the remains of the Clotilda, the last ship to bring a cargo of Africans to the United States to be enslaved, were found in Alabama. I've had the honor of conducting an oral history with an elderly gentleman who knew Cujo, one of the Africans brought to Mobile, Alabama on that ship. At the earliest Juneteenths, there were readings of the Emancipation Proclamation. Today, these questions and more are explored through poetry, song, and other forms of creative expression. These expressions are as complicated as our understanding of freedom itself, at once thankful, but also reflective of the inherent challenges in attaining and keeping that freedom. From the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade and throughout the antebellum period, enslaved Africans suffered disruptions to the family unit. We speak most often of the Middle Passage and the millions torn from their home and families from the African continent. But what is less well known is that another million African Americans were torn from their families during the domestic slave trade, in which the enslaved were sold from plantations in the Upper South to new territory in the Lower South, to places such as Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas to supply workers to keep up with the booming cotton industry. Therefore, at the end of the Civil War, we know that one of the primary goals of the freedmen and women was to reunite with family members and to highlight the fact that they had managed to maintain a sense of family and community under unimaginable conditions where parents did not have authority over their own children and the sanctity of marriage was not recognized. This short quote from a formerly enslaved woman named Caroline Hunter illustrates the vulnerability of the parent-child relationship under slavery. During slavery, it seemed like your children belonged to everybody but you. Many a day, my old mama has stood by and watched massa beat her children till they bled and she couldn't open her mouth. They didn't only beat us, but they used to strap my mama to a bench or box and beat her with a wooden paddle while she was naked. Often, family had to be defined in ways other than blood. Your family became those who managed to survive and thrive with you. Juneteenth celebrations honor all of these bonds, those of blood and those who have earned the titles of brother, sister, cousin, aunt, and uncle through struggle and experience. This is how it still is in many Black families, including my own. When we moved to California from Detroit, we left our blood kin behind, but over the years, we constructed a unit that we call the J19 family. At Juneteenth gatherings, we nurture our children and train them to be the next generation of leaders by putting them in the forefront of the program and giving them special responsibilities. We give thanks for those who have survived and remember those who did not. Finally, the third but by no means less significant feature, Finally, the third, but by no means least significant feature of Juneteenth is the pure expression of joy. Though burdened with generations of oppression, it was and is important for African Americans to proclaim that their ability to feel joy has not been suppressed, that they can still touch that place in themselves that is grateful to be alive, thankful for the family that survived, for the gift of another day to fight for freedoms that may be just out of reach, for the blessings of faith, community, and the ability to love. Joy is manifested in the making and sharing of an abundance of food centered on the barbecue pit, supplemented by the color red, as in watermelon, red beans, and red soda pop. Joy is manifested through the playing of music, singing, dancing. It is not uncommon to hear African drumming or the singing of the African American national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. You will find each of these elements in Juneteenth celebrations: explorations of the meaning of freedom, a focus on family and children, and pure, unadulterated expressions of utter joy. It is no coincidence that Juneteenth is experiencing another revival, as similarly to the 1960s and 70s, the unresolved issues of slavery, race, and injustice have bubbled to the surface. As part of the domestic slave trade that I spoke of earlier, Jesuit priests at Georgetown University sold 272 enslaved human beings to plantations in Louisiana to cover debt back in 1838. The ghosts of this sale have returned, and Georgetown is leading a field of Ivy League institutions that are coming to terms with their slave-owning past. And of course, at this very moment, we are in the midst of a worldwide uprising against the killing of unarmed African Americans at the hands of law enforcement. Americans are searching for ways to come together and heal. Juneteenth provides a context in which to do that. It is a holiday that all Americans who believe in freedom, family, and joy can rally around. Here at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, it is our mission to tell the American story through an African American lens and to create a space for healing and reconciliation. As the coordinator of our growing oral history initiative, I am acutely aware of the significance of capturing the stories of African Americans at this moment in time. These stories will be just as important to future historians and thinkers as the WPA slave narratives done in the 1930s that I've been quoting in this talk are to historians now. In the spirit of Juneteenth, let us never forget the sacrifices made so that we have the luxury to experience freedom and to interrogate its evolving meanings. Let us celebrate our families and children, and let us express our joy to be alive and in the company of like minds and hearts. Thank you.